80 years ago, the world exhaled after holding its breath through the most violent storm in human history. But the story you were taught about the end of World War II is a carefully edited reel, a clean fade-out that hides the shadows still moving when the lights came back on. Because the war did not end with cheering crowds alone. It ended with cities glowing like dying stars, with secrets locked in steel cabinets, with borders redrawn by men who already feared the next war before the current one was cold. And if you listen closely to the silence after the guns stopped, you can still hear what school never told you, the things that didn't fit into neat timelines or moral diagrams, the uncomfortable truths that explain the world you are living in right now. Because on August nights in 1945, while radios announced victory and church bells rang, entire civilizations were being reshaped without consent, without mercy, and often without witnesses. And to understand what really happened at the end of World War II, you have to step beyond the familiar images of VE Day kisses and VJ Day parades and walk instead into the ruins, the secret meetings, the broken promises, and the human aftermath that followed the last official surrender. Because wars do not end when treaties are signed, they end when consequences stop unfolding. And in many ways, World War II never truly ended at all. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Europe looked less like a continent and more like a mass grave stretching from the Atlantic to the outskirts of Moscow. With over 40 million dead, entire cities flattened into dust, and millions of displaced people wandering roads with no maps and no nations left to return to. And yet the images most remembered are flags and smiles, not the revenge killings, the mass rapes, the forced marches, and the quiet starvation that followed liberation. Because liberation did not feel like freedom for everyone, especially in Eastern Europe, where the arrival of the Red Army replaced one occupation with another. And while textbooks framed the Soviets as heroic liberators who broke the back of Nazi Germany, they often skipped the part where Stalin treated conquered territories as spoils, not partners, installing puppet governments, dismantling factories to ship east, and using secret police to silence dissent. Because the end of Nazi rule did not bring democracy to Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or East Germany. It brought a new authoritarian system justified by victory. And this was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was planned years in advance, even while Allied leaders smiled for cameras at conferences like Yalta and Potsdam, where the future of millions was decided by a handful of men in closed rooms, trading influence like chips at a table, and promising free elections they had no intention of allowing. Because the war had taught them that power came not from ideals, but from control of territory and force. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, survival itself was the first challenge, because victory did not mean food, warmth, or stability. It meant rationing that continued for years, black markets that thrived in the shadows, and a generation of children growing up among rubble. And while the Marshall Plan is often celebrated as a generous act of American rebuilding, what is less emphasized is that it was also a strategic weapon designed to prevent desperation from turning Western Europe toward communism, tying economies to the United States through aid, trade, and political alignment. And it worked, but not without cost, because it cemented a divided Europe that would remain split for nearly half a century, with an iron curtain that was not a metaphor, but a real line guarded by guns, mines, and walls. And that division, born directly from the unresolved tensions at the war's end, shaped every major global crisis that followed, from Berlin to Cuba to Vietnam. And then there is Japan, where the war ended not with an invasion, but with a blinding flash that rewrote the rules of human conflict forever. Because Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just military events, they were philosophical ones, proof that humanity had created the ability to annihilate itself in seconds. And while history classes often frame the atomic bombings as tragic but necessary, a grim calculation to save lives by avoiding invasion, they rarely explore the deeper context,
the fact that Japan was already seeking ways to surrender, that the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan shocked Tokyo's leadership more than the bombs themselves, or that the United States was also sending a message, not just to Japan, but to the world, especially to the Soviet Union, about who now held ultimate power. And this message did not end in 1945. It echoed through arms races, nuclear standoffs, and a persistent fear that still hangs over international politics today. Because once the atomic genie escaped the bottle, there was no putting it back, only building more bottles and hoping none would break. But the end of World War II was not only about geopolitics and weapons, it was also about justice, or rather, selective justice. Because while the Nuremberg trials are remembered as a triumph of international law, holding Nazi leaders accountable for crimes against humanity, they also established a precedent filled with contradictions, as only the defeated were judged, while Allied actions, such as the firebombing of Dresden, Tokyo, and other cities, which killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, were never put on trial, creating a moral asymmetry that still fuels debates about war crimes and victors' justice. And beyond Europe, accountability was even thinner, because in Asia, many Japanese officials responsible for horrific experiments, mass killings, and biological warfare escaped punishment entirely in exchange for their research handed over to American intelligence during the early Cold War, their victims erased from official memory, their suffering deemed inconvenient. And this silence is part of why historical wounds in East Asia remain open, feeding tensions between nations decades later. Even the idea that fascism was decisively defeated in 1945 is more comforting than accurate, because while regimes fell, many of the people, structures, and ideologies adapted and survived, with former Nazis reintegrated into West German society, industry, and government to ensure stability against communism, and with scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers quietly recruited by the United States and the Soviet Union alike through programs like Operation Paperclip, where past crimes were overlooked in the race for technological advantage, meaning that the post-war world was literally built in part by the same minds that had served the Third Reich, a fact rarely emphasized in school books that prefer clear villains and heroes over moral complexity. And then there are the millions whose stories never made it into any official narrative, the displaced persons camps filled with Holocaust survivors who had nowhere to go, often unwelcome even in their former homes, the ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe in brutal population transfers that killed hundreds of thousands, the women who survived rape and violence in silence because speaking meant shame rather than support, and the soldiers who returned home physically alive but psychologically shattered, carrying trauma that had no name yet because post-traumatic stress disorder would not be recognized for decades, leaving them to cope alone in societies eager to forget and move on, because remembering was painful and forgetting was convenient. In the colonial world, the end of World War II was not a liberation, but a catalyst, because European empires emerged weakened and indebted, their authority shattered by occupation and defeat, and millions of colonial subjects who had fought and died for empires that promised freedom now demanded it for themselves, sparking independence movements across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, from India to Indonesia to Vietnam. And while textbooks often treat decolonization as a separate chapter, it was inseparable from the war's end, because the contradiction of fighting fascism abroad while enforcing colonial rule at home became impossible to justify, leading to violent struggles as former imperial powers tried to hold on, and in many cases, Cold War politics replaced colonial control, turning newly independent nations into proxy battlegrounds, meaning that for much of the world, the end of World War II simply marked the beginning of different wars, fought with different flags, but similar human cost. Even the concept of a rules-based international order, symbolized by the creation of the United Nations, emerged from the ashes of 1945 with both hope and hypocrisy, because while the UN promised collective security and human rights, its structure reflected the power realities of the victors, granting veto power to the same nations whose rivalries had nearly destroyed the world. And while it has prevented some conflicts and provided a platform for diplomacy, it has also been paralyzed in moments of crisis, a reminder that the system built after World War II was designed not for universal justice, but for managing great power competition without another global catastrophe, a goal that has been achieved so far at the cost of countless smaller wars. As the years passed, memory itself became a battleground because nations crafted narratives that emphasized heroism and sacrifice while minimizing complicity and atrocity. And education systems simplified a complex war into digestible lessons, partly to teach values, partly to avoid reopening wounds, and partly because confronting the full truth would raise uncomfortable questions about morality, responsibility, and the thin line between civilization and barbarism. And this selective memory shaped generations, influencing how people understand nationalism, military power, and the idea of necessary violence, making it easier to accept new wars framed as just or unavoidable. 80 years later, the consequences of how World War II ended are everywhere if you know where to look, in the borders that still spark conflict, in alliances that trace their origins to wartime necessity, in nuclear arsenals maintained by fear rather than trust, and in unresolved historical grievances that resurface whenever crises erupt. Because history does not stay in the past, it accumulates interest, and the debt left unpaid in 1945 continues to shape the present, reminding us that the end of the war was not a clean break, but a hinge moment, swinging the world from one era of violence into another, quieter but no less dangerous. The lesson that rarely makes it into classrooms is not that good triumphed over evil, but that survival often required compromise, that victory carried moral costs, and that peace built on unresolved trauma and power imbalance is fragile by design. And understanding this does not diminish the sacrifices made by those who fought and died. It honors them by refusing to reduce their suffering to slogans, by acknowledging that the war's end was both a miracle and a warning, proof of humanity's capacity to unite against destruction and its equal capacity to repeat it. Because if there is one truth hidden beneath the celebrations of 1945, it is that the world that emerged was not healed, only reorganized, and the choices made in that moment, in the rubble of cities and the smoke of battlefields, are still unfolding today, asking a question that remains unanswered 80 years later, not whether we remember World War II, but whether we truly learned from how it ended.